Welcome back. Today we are going to take a look at the early peoples of North and South America. Before we get started, imagine that you are living in an area and you have lived there for many generations. As time passed, the weather begins to get colder and all of your food sources begin to move south. What would you do? Would you stay in an area that has been your home for generations, or would you be forced to follow your food source? This was the question that early humans had to deal with during what we call the Great Migration. During the Great Migration, the land bridge that connects the northern tip of North America to the northernmost point in Asia had been exposed. So there's a strait that runs right here. It's called the Bering Strait. And during the Ice Age, all of the water in the Arctic Ocean had been frozen. Okay, so the Bering Strait dried up, froze, and exposed a small piece of land that was called a land bridge. This land bridge connected Siberia to North America, and it allowed early humans to migrate from Asia through what is now Alaska in the northern part of Canada and down and populate North and South America. Early humans were following their animals southwards because their main food source were these animals. Remember, early humans were hunters and gatherers. So when the animals started to move southward, the humans had no choice but to follow. This journey took thousands of years. It didn't happen overnight. Okay, people were walking hundreds of thousands of miles. And as they moved south, the climate continued to change. It began to get warmer. These humans then began to shift from hunting and gathering, meaning they began to shift from following their food sources, to instead becoming farmers, to creating permanent settlements. And we know that when people began to farm, civilization emerged. So, how did the agricultural revolution change the Americas? Well, we know that the agricultural revolution was when people figured out that they could scatter seeds in the ground, water them, and then food would grow. And then they decided to build settlements around these fields. Okay, well, in the Americas, the further south they got, the warmer climate they exposed. So they moved out of the kind of ice capsulated regions into the more rolling farm fields. So farming meant that there were going to be fewer nomadic tribes. You had less people moving around and following their food sources. Instead, you had larger settlements. These settlements meant that more people were living together. And the more people you have living together means that you have an increased need for some sort of government. And from all of this, we have lots of different groups of people, different civilizations that emerged throughout the Americas. So when we talk about the Americas, we're going to break it down into North America and South America and Central America. So who are the native North Americans? Well, just like we have people living throughout North America today, early humans also had people spread throughout North America. In the northwestern part of what is now the United States and the southern part of Canada, you had a group of people called the Northwest or the Pacific North Americans. Okay, these are people who focused on fishing, weaving baskets, and woodworking. They are known for their totem poles, which is what this picture is over here at the right. And then they would have gatherings called potlatches, where whoever was hosting these gatherings would bring out kind of their material goods and then they would give them to the guests and it would help raise their social status. So it was like the exchange of these totem poles and these canoes and these different weavings and baskets. In the southwestern part of the United States, you have a group of people that were called the Hohokam. And these people used irrigation to grow their crops, right? Because we know today that the southwestern part of the United States is very dry. Thousands of years ago, however, there was an abundant river running through the region. So the Hohokam people figured out how to pipe that water from the river to their fields so they were able to grow bean, corn, and cotton. You also had another group of people, the Pueblo people, that built adobe houses like what you see down here on the left. that you can still find today throughout Arizona and New Mexico. These are houses that used the adobe clay that were baked in the sun to make hardened bricks, to build these structures almost into the earth. You had another group of early North Americans that lived in the Great Plains regions. Okay, so this is kind of like the central part of the United States. And contrary to what we see today, where the majority of our farmland is in the central part of the United States, these Great Plains natives only had a little bit of farming. Okay, they farmed for bean, corn, and squash. But the majority of their food came from the buffalo that they hunted. So they were a largely nomadic people. They used what we called the jump herd technique, where they would travel with different herds depending on the time of the year. So they weren't over hunting one buffalo herd compared to the other. And these people lived in the cooler climate, like we know today, right? We live in the Great Plains region. We know that it snows during the year. Therefore, they had to utilize the whole buffalo when they would hunt them. So they would use the buffalo meat for food, but then they would use their hide and their skins and their fur for protection, to help build their teepees and their shelter. And then they would use their bone for tools and various other things. Right? They weren't super great farmers because they oftentimes had to use inadequate farm tools, but then they also traveled around a lot. Okay, like I said, they lived in the nomadic life, meaning that they could pick up their stuff and travel frequently whenever the buffalo herd moves. So they lived in homes that were called teepees, which you guys have probably all seen. They're easily broken down, packed and rolled away and carried. And then they began to practice domesticating or keeping smaller herd animals that traveled with them. Okay, the last group of people that we are going to look at from North America were the Mississippians. These were people that lived along the Mississippi River and to the east as far as South Carolina, roughly from the year 1050 to 1250 CE, or Common Era. Okay? Like I said, they lived along the Mississippi River, which we know begins in Minnesota and runs all the way down to Louisiana and east. So they lived in the eastern half of the United States. Okay. Their largest city was Choquia, and it was found near present-day St. Louis, Missouri. Okay. And we think that this ancient city had a population of nearly 30,000 people. That's like the size of Cottage Grove, which for ancient times is a really big city. The Mississippians were great mound builders, meaning in their cities and in their settlements, they built these ceremonial mounds in the centers or around the outskirts that often served as burial sites. Okay, Choquia was the largest settlement that we have found of early North American peoples, and extensive digging around the area has showed that their society was complex and extensive thousands of years before archaeologists and geographers thought that advanced peoples lived in North America. Okay, so now we're going to get into the meat of things, where we look at Central and South America. The first group of people that we are going to look at were the Olmecs. Okay, the Olmecs lived in present-day Mexico from roughly 1500 to 400 BCE. Okay, and this was the first major civilization in Central America or in Mexico. Archaeologists and geographers and historians don't know a ton about the Olmec, but what we do know is that they lived along the Gulf Coast of Mexico. So they lived kind of along the warmer areas here and down along the peninsula. Okay. We also know that the Olmecs had a high level of culture based on the artifacts that we have found and the size of the temples that we have found that date back to this area. We also know that they worshipped the jaguar as one of their many gods. Okay, so the jaguar was the most important god in Olmec society and Olmec civilization, and a lot of their temples were dedicated to the jaguar. We found a type of hieroglyphic writing in which they were able to use symbols to record data. We know that they had a calendar and tracked solar movements, and tracked like the movement of the stars and the moon and the sun and the planets. And then we also know that they had a two-class system that was made up of farmers, who were the majority of people, and then rulers, or the aristocratic class, or the people that made the decisions. Okay. The Olmec society was a matrilineal culture in Mesoamerica. Right? That means that they followed the mother's genealogy instead of the father's. So here in the United States, we typically have a patrilineal culture where when women get married, they take the husband's name. And then if you have children, they take the father's last name. And you can kind of trace your ancestry through your father. Right? The Olmecs were the opposite. So they were very matrilineal. So they traced their families through their mother's side of things. We also know that the Olmecs were considered to be fairly advanced because we found 15 of these giant sculptures or colossal heads. One of these heads weighs about 40 tons, which is a lot. Okay? And it is made of a type of rock that was found roughly 40 to 50 miles away from where the heads were found. So, in order to sculpt these heads using this type of rock, and then transport them the 40 to 50 miles to where they need to be, the Olmecs had to have some sort of organization to their culture. Okay. So what were some of the Olmec beliefs? Like I said, the power of the animal world were super important to the Olmec. Okay, they appreciated the animals. They believed that animals had kind of like this sixth sense or the optimal spirit. So the optimal spirit meant spirituality and intellect of a man, but the ferocity and strength of a jaguar. So it combines like human and animal characteristics into one. We don't really know what happened to the Olmec. All we know is that signs of their civilization began to disappear somewhere between the year 400 and 200 BCE. Archaeologists have found the ancient city of Teotihuacan in the northeastern part of present-day Mexico City. Okay, it's about 30 miles northeast of Mexico City. And what archaeologists don't know is who exactly lived at Teotihuacan. Okay? What they do know is that it's this giant city that you can see from here. The city extends this way, has temples here and here. What archaeologists do know is that it had a peak population of over 100,000 people. So roughly the size of like Minneapolis or St. Paul. And what archaeologists have found based on digging in the city and kind of doing an archaeological excavation is that whoever lived at Teotihuacan were successful sculptors and stonecutters. You can find statues like this head down here throughout the temples, that they grew corn because we found like corn maize in the ground and in the stone itself. And these people appear to have been very peaceful. There's no sign of war or conflict or battle throughout the whole city. So here's the archaeological site of Teotihuacan. So you can see that at the northern end, you have the Pyramid of the Moon, and then you have the Pyramid of the Sun that's kind of off to the side. And then at the very end, you have the Temple of Quetzalcoatl, which Quetzalcoatl was one of the gods. Then you have like this main strip, and all along the main strip, you have a series of smaller temples and homes, but then you have all these roads kind of that lead out of the city with smaller homes or buildings along the outskirts. So it looks like this main drag was kind of like the main hub or the main part of the city, and then the people lived in the surrounding area. So at Teotihuacan, the Pyramid of the Sun is the tallest pyramid that exists in Mexico, and it stands at over 216 feet high, and is 10 acres at its base. Okay, so at its widest point, that's 10 acres. That's the same measurement as the Great Pyramid in Egypt. Okay, and what we don't know is who exactly built this Great Pyramid in Mexico City. Who built the city of Teotihuacan? What we do know is that the Toltecs were the next group of people that invaded Mexico sometime after the fall of whoever was living at Teotihuacan. And the Toltecs built their capital at Tula and spread their influence throughout the Yucatan Peninsula. Toltec culture was a ruler-based society based on warriors. So your military elite or your soldiers were going to be the ones that were making the decisions. The god that the Toltecs worshipped was a god by the name of Quetzalcoatl. And Quetzalcoatl was a serpent-like god that demanded human sacrifice in order to be pleased. So both of these images are depicting human sacrifice to Quetzalcoatl. And the Toltecs were ancestors of the Aztec people. Okay, so the Aztec were descendants from the Toltecs. So we're going to see a lot of similarities between the Toltec and the Aztecs. And when the Toltecs invaded and kind of took over the Yucatan Peninsula, they encountered a crumbling Maya empire. So they caught the tail end of the Maya. Who were the Maya? The Maya were the most advanced people in Latin America at that time. They occupied the Yucatan Peninsula, or this area of Mexico that kind of juts out into the Gulf of Mexico. We know that they built pyramids, just like whoever lived at Teotihuacan. Okay? They had a series of hieroglyphic writing, which they were able to keep their records and record information. They had a counting system that included the concept of zero, like we have today. We know that they were astronomers and studied the movement of the sun and the moon and the stars. And we know that many of their rulers lived in the great city of Chichen Itza. Okay, so Chichen Itza was the capital of the Maya Empire. And it is right here, kind of on the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula, close to where modern-day Tulum is, if you've ever been there. Okay, these are pictures from the ancient city of Chichen Itza. Okay, you can see the great pyramids that the Maya built. This was kind of like a sporting area. This was a game that ancient Maya played that is very similar to the game of lacrosse that we play today. Okay. A few years ago, the Science Museum in Minnesota had a Maya exhibit in which you can see various different statues that were carved. This is a headdress or bust that's supposed to kind of honor, represent the god Quetzalcoatl. This talks about how the Maya altered their bodies in pursuit of beauty, so they wanted to look more beautiful. Okay, these are teeth that have gems implanted into them, so they would like physically drill holes into their teeth and fill them with jade or other precious stones. Okay, they pierced their ears, their nose, their lips. Tattoos were prevalent, and overall body modification was very common throughout the Mayan Empire. Okay, again, this is just a representation of what Chichen Itza looked like. It's like a rendering of the giant city. You notice that there's a giant pyramid at one end over here, another one over here, and then people live in the surrounding areas. Okay, again, just other artifacts. So the Aztec are the next group of people that we are going to take a look at. So remember, when the Mayan Empire starts to crumble and fall, the Toltecs move in. Okay, and the Toltecs were ancestors to the Aztecs, so early version of the Aztecs. And the Aztecs had wandered into Mexico, and the legend of their settlement says that they saw a sign, or they got a sign from the gods that told them to build their city in the middle of Lake Texcoco. So what they did is they brought in um, like land and dirt from the surrounding areas and built a floating city. Okay, and the city was the city of Tenochtitlan. So it was built in the middle of this giant lake. Okay, and this city was large and it was thriving, and it included pyramids, markets, and palaces. And throughout the city, the Aztecs borrowed cultures from other ancient peoples, such as the Toltecs, which we know are their ancestors, but then also the Maya and the Olmec. Okay. Just like the Maya and the Toltec, the Aztec worshipped the serpent god Quetzalcoatl, so they practiced human sacrifice. They farmed on floating fields, okay, called chinampas. So basically, they would float these small patches of land in the lake and grow food on these small land patches. So then they also had abundance of water because, again, they built a floating city. They were a warrior based society, so the highest social class was to be a soldier or a warrior. And the Aztecs were famously conquered by Spanish conquistadors in the 14 and 1500s by a man named Hernan Cortez. So we will talk about Hernan Cortez and the conquering of the Aztec people in trimester 2. Moving down to South America, you have a group of people that lived all along the Andes Mountains that were called the Inca. And the Inca considered themselves to be children of the sun, meaning they worshipped the sun and the moon. The Inca Empire stretched along the western coast of South America here. Okay, so all the way from Colombia through Peru, down through Chile and into Argentina. Okay. The capital of the Incan Empire was at Cusco, and here is where the emperor lived. The emperor had total and complete power in the Inca Empire. Okay, and Sapa Inca was the last Incan ruler before the Inca were colonized and taken over by European settlers. So, how the Inca Empire was able to stretch and spread throughout the coast was that they colonized new areas by constantly moving their people up and down the coast. And all of these little villages and cities were connected with roads in which messages could be spread from one end of the empire to the other. So every time they took over a new empire, they didn't kill the people that lived there. Instead, they folded them into their new empire and their new society. So Incan culture had farming just like other early American-based societies. And however, because the Inca lived in the Andes Mountains, so they lived in mountain terrain, they farmed on these things called terraces, which is what you see right here. And these terraces are just these plateaus, or almost like a step-like system of farm fields. So when it rains, the rain just falls down the terrace and everything gets watered. The Inca Empire had very vast and diverse kingdoms where many languages were spoken. Okay. However, they did have an official language throughout the region, and that was Quechua. Okay. Today, you can still go to parts of Peru and go up into the Andes Mountains, and you can still find people who can speak Quechua today. The Inca did not have a writing system like other early peoples in Central America. However, they did have a record-keeping system called the quipu. Okay, and the quipu was what you see this bottom picture to be. It was a series of strings and knots, and each string and each knot represented a certain value. So it was a way of counting things, whether it was people, animals, money, days of the year, things like that. So you find lots of different versions of the quipu. Inca also had very advanced medical practices, and they had advanced education systems. The most famous Incan city is the ancient city of Machu Picchu. Okay. This is the archaeological site of Machu Picchu today. It is built on top of a mountain range in the Andes Mountains. You can travel to Machu Picchu today and see the extent of these Incan cities. Okay, so this is where we are going to end our notes. What I want you to think about is, why did each civilization we discussed adopt similar cultures? Why did they all practice certain farming methods? Why did they all worship similar gods? Why did they have warrior based societies? And what was the purpose of building these temples?